Hello everyone, this is Cook Serve Delicious 3. I had seen just recently that this was actually coming into early access, so like a week ago or so, and I sort of realized at that point that I'd never actually covered one of these games before, and I figured that I really needed to remedy that, so here we are. Cook Serve Delicious is a very fast-selling indie franchise that just it was one of those small games that sort of took the world by storm all of a sudden for a little while, because, you know, it just came out of nowhere and people just kept playing it, and then it spread by word of mouth and by video, and it just kind of went from there and eventually exploded into this big, like, have you played this sort of culture thing. And that's because it's really unique and really, really fun. There's not really much out there that's like it. I mean, I guess that's what unique means. But you could kind of consider it a combination food or restaurant simulator and typing tutor. It's really different. And then, of course, there was also the well-respected sequel, and then finally the early access campaign for this. So Cook Serve Delicious 3 takes place sort of after the other games. There is a plot, yes, where instead of being in a restaurant, you are actually in a food truck, which is pretty cool. It adds a little bit of a different theme to it. And by the way, this is actually a post-apocalyptic universe, for those of you who don't know, or at least this entry in it is, which is kind of funny. You are in a post-apocalyptic food truck, and other rival food trucks will indeed try to harm you at certain points, but I'm not going to spoil how all that works. And the basic gist of the game is you will need to embark on food truck stops throughout multiple different days, each one having different menus and going to different areas where you will need to gather and cook the proper amounts of different foods to keep people happy. And the game is really stressful, I should point out. These games are very time-based, and as such, of course, you know, in classic like restaurant simulation style thing, you have very impatient customers. So you got to make sure to get your foods done on the way there and arrive with the right amount of food, and then take special orders, and then try and get dishes to people correctly and on time. And yeah, it's really, really stressful. But it's very fun in that regard because it's just a complete challenge all the way through. There's pretty much no part of it that allows you to calm down. You only realize that you probably haven't been breathing for the entire trip once you actually finish. So you will select a route to go on, and the route will have different requirements, from various point values of foods to different types of foods, like only solids, barbecue stuff, stuff like only sweets, and things like that. And then you will create a menu that you will take along with you. You have these prep stations that you can use, and there will be usually about 3 foods that are required that you select for these prep stations. And they range from all kinds of different things. There are a ton of foods in this game, from the first and second game, as well as things that are new to this one. And you'll also have your stations at the side there, which are special order stations that you can cook foods when they are requested, whereas the prep stations are things that you cook in advance, so that when you arrive at the area you will be able to immediately sell them, whereas the special order stuff is, of course, basically a la carte. It is stuff that you make only when it is ordered. During your initial trips, you will have some prep time. You will have basically driving to the next destination to sell. You will have a menu that you can call down that will tell you how many of each of your prep station foods you can actually cook, or I suppose holding station would be the correct term. Holding station foods you need to cook. And you will start off with 4 holding stations, but there is an upgrade system that you can use to unlock more holding stations later on if you wish, so that you can prep more food easier. Because sometimes, depending on what you actually choose, you may not actually be able to successfully prep every single food that you need in advance. Some of them you may have to try and squirrel in there in between other orders. And then as you're doing this, and as you're traveling to the next destination, you will also get these special orders and the prep stations on the side, and you will have to make those, because those are quite valuable oftentimes, and they are a nice thing since they're not as time limited. I mean, they do have a time aspect to them, but if you complete them, you can just immediately serve them as soon as you get to the destination for points without having to worry about timing and stuff, which is nice. Each food has a different way of actually making it, and this is where the whole typing tutor thing comes in. Every food, you can just use your mouse and click on things if you want to, but that's actually quite slow, and it's definitely recommended that you use the key combinations for each food to learn them. To the point where actually on the menu where you select what foods you want for your upcoming trip, you can actually practice every individual food, whether you've unlocked them or not, and try and memorize how you actually make them. As I mentioned earlier, foods have point values. A lot of foods have 0 points, but as you unlock more foods throughout the game, you'll be finding more foods with these point values, and different routes may actually require, they have like a 3-point menu, so you have to have foods that add up to at least 3 points, or like a 5-point menu, and things like that. So it does require you to make more complex foods, because the foods with the higher point values are worth more money at the end of the day when you actually complete the level, but they also tend to have more complex steps and a lot more variance in making them, to the point where some really high point value foods, like your 4-point foods, are really complicated and take like a long time. So you do want to be careful. There's a lot of strategy in this game, honestly, about planning, because planning your trip is really important. You need to simultaneously manage the foods that you're going to take to make sure that they actually meet the requirements for the level, but you're also going to want to make sure that you have some foods that are not as difficult to make or not as time-consuming to make, so that, you know, you don't want all of your foods necessarily, unless you're at a really hard level and you have to be really complicated and time-consuming, or else you're just not going to have time for everything. You're going to want some foods that have a smaller number of steps, some foods that you can deliver immediately without extra steps on top of them, and things like that. And planning out which foods to take is actually really important, because, you know, it's not just about meeting the requirements for the level, it's also about how they will work together to hopefully make your trip not too crazy difficult. Now, you'll also, of course, notice that foods spoil, and different foods spoil at different rates. The balaclava, for instance, is one that's kind of notorious as an early food that you can get that spoils quite quickly, but is not too complicated to make. So you also have to make sure to, you know, since you want to make food in advance, you want to make sure to make it in advance enough to be ready when you get there, but not so far in advance that it's going to spoil before you can serve it all. And of course, you don't want a whole bunch of foods that spoil around the same time, or else you may find yourself in a very difficult place when it comes to like forward planning for the next stop. So yeah, there's a surprising amount of strategy involved in actually making sure that your runs go successfully. If you use the wrong key combinations for foods, or if you don't deliver them in time, then you will of course get bad grades, and the game is very exacting. It is really quite rough on you. If you want a gold medal on a stage, you have to absolutely perfect it. You cannot miss anything, you can't have any of the customers leave, you can't do any of the dishes wrong. You have to have like a completely perfect run for a gold medal. If you just time out on even one dish, or you get one ingredient wrong on one dish, say goodbye to your gold medal. If you want that, you have to do it absolutely perfectly. And that's stressful, but it's also really fun. I like games with a fairly high skill ceiling and a pretty noticeable skill floor, because it's not afraid to say, you know, just because you're playing the game doesn't necessarily mean you get to see all the content. You're not necessarily entitled to see all the content until you get really good at the game, because there are some levels that are locked behind gold medals and a lot of silver medals and things like that, so you don't get to see those unless you get good enough to actually unlock them, which I think is pretty cool, because it's a high-skill game. It's stressful and it's hectic and there's a lot to do, so it fits very much that some of the stuff is going to be locked behind very high-skill challenges to actually perform. I like that. As I mentioned, every food has its own key combination to make sure it works correctly. If the aforementioned balaclava, for instance, is just, I believe it's P, N, P, N, P, is the like 5-layer step, and every different food will have a different one, and you will start to slowly memorize them, and as you go through, and that's kind of the point, you're supposed to be able to make them sort of without a second thought. And then there are some foods like the bubble tea there in the background that aren't necessarily the same key combination every time, because the wanted ingredients can change. You can make cookies, but there are like 8 different kinds of cookies, so it's not going to be the same key combination each time, because you have to actually pay attention to what the order requests. Same with the tea, got to make sure to get the right flavors and everything in there in the right order. There are some that have multiple steps, so like those right there that you're seeing are very easy, you just plop them in the fryer and go, but there are some, like for instance, a very early simple example is biscuits and gravy. You just make the biscuits at first, but when you have to serve them, you have to do another step, which is to actually put the biscuits down, put the gravy on top of them, and then serve them to the customer. So you have an extra step, you don't just make them and they're done, you have to make them and then serve them correctly, which takes extra time, but that's a very simple example. Some of them get a lot more complicated than that. And there are just a ton of foods in the game, and I like the fact that this whole key combination thing kind of gives the foods their own personality, which I know is weird to say because it's just inanimate food, but the fact that you sort of have to memorize these different combinations and the different ways that each food works does give each one a bit of their own personality and a bit of their own, well, I don't want to use flavor because that's kind of a bad pun, but really that's the case. Every food has its own sort of individuality that you have to get used to in order to make sure you're cooking it both in the correct order and at the right speed to actually make sure you're not slowing yourself down too much and bogging down under a bunch of customer orders that you can't get done in time. It's awesome. It's just such a fantastic game. It is in early access, but it doesn't really feel like it at this stage. I will say that probably one of the most like early access seeming things that you'll find at first is the fact that not all of the food descriptions are in. The foods actually have full-on like multi-paragraph descriptions about their history, where they come from, and what they're like, which is really, really awesome. As someone who enjoys food and a lot of different like cultural foods from around the world, that's a really awesome touch to be able to actually get some real-life information on some of these foods I've never heard of before. But some of those are not in yet. You know, the foods are there and they work just fine, but the descriptions are not done. That's really minor, honestly, but that's just one of the early access things that is, it's not finished. There are still a ton of foods to choose from, though, and there are a ton of levels to go through. Like I said, some of them are locked behind metal. Well, a lot of them are locked behind metals, but some of them are locked behind very high tier metals. You'll have to get like 30 silver medals or 10 gold medals to do certain levels, and those are your very free-form, very difficult challenges. So the fact that it's locked behind kind of showing high skill at the game makes sense, because the level themselves are going to be quite a skill test to actually get through successfully. It's really good, honestly. I have like no complaints about this game whatsoever. Pretty much everything about it, every aspect of it is enjoyable to me, and even though I can't play it for too long at a time because it's very stressful, it does what it does to such a high degree of success that I can't not enjoy it. There's a fair amount of progression because you do earn these like bitcoins, basically, that allow you to buy new recipes and get more complicated, more difficult, and more valuable menus as you go through the game. And you'll also have the upgrade system once you hit level 5 that lets you upgrade different aspects of your food truck for better usage, although some of the upgrades do make the game a little bit more difficult because they give you more dishes to juggle, more stuff to pay attention to, and luckily those upgrades can actually be toggled on or off as you upgrade yourself, so they aren't just like a permanent decision. Like, you can go through the upgrades to continue through the tree, but you don't necessarily have to deal with the extra difficulty at all times if you're finding it a bit too difficult right now. Obviously, that would make the upgrade kind of not exactly an upgrade if you couldn't deal with it properly, so the fact that they let you still take it but toggle it is a really, really nice thing. The game also has a new mode to the series, a chill mode, that gives the customers like infinite patience. Basically, they won't leave, so you can actually cook things at your own pace, although you can only earn silver medals in this mode. If you want gold medals, you have to do the normal, challenging, timed mode, which makes sense. Chill mode is a very good way to sort of practice and get some practical experience when it comes to how the game is fully going to work without also needing to worry about the very exacting timer that the game has. So if you're not fully sure, it does have that mode that allows you to go through the story, get silver medals, and understand the game mechanics before you challenge yourself to the harder levels with the more stressful timed element. It's fantastic. I would absolutely recommend it. These games are just made with so much love. They have so much of their own personality that they're just very difficult to actually to not enjoy. They're so much fun. And it's only $15 right now on Early Access, which is absolutely fantastic because there are already just dozens and dozens of foods to make. There are 117 levels already in the game, so you're not really lacking for content here, and that price seems incredibly fair, in my opinion, and there are more foods and levels and stuff to come. There's even a co-op mode, a couch co-op mode. You might even be able to use remote play together with it, I'm not sure. But anyway, yeah, that's Cook Serve Delicious 3. It's a really awesome value proposition for a really fantastically themed, well-made game that you just won't really find anything else like these games. They are very much their own thing. The devs have kind of cornered their own market in that regard because there's just nothing offered that's like this, and that absolutely makes them worth experiencing, in my opinion. So much personality and character to these games. They're just a unique thing, and I always appreciate that. So thank you guys very much for watching. The link is, of course, in the description below this video for the link to the early access if you want to take a look at it, wishlist it, get into it yourself, whatever you want to do. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.